It is exactly 10 a.m. Eastern Time. A tanker carrying Iranian crude oil is moving through one of the most strategically important waterways on Earth. Then, suddenly, everything changes. The captain receives a transmission over the radio, a direct warning. U.S. naval forces are ordering the vessel to immediately reverse course. This is not a drill. This is not a warning. This is a live, actively enforced naval blockade. The first time in decades that the United States has implemented something of this scale. And just like that, the global situation shifts. This is not theoretical. As of this morning, the blockade is real. It has officially begun. And what you are about to hear will show you exactly why this single move has the potential to reshape Iran's economy, reroute global energy flows, put China in an extremely difficult position, and either push Iran toward one of the most important diplomatic agreements in a generation, or pull the entire region into something far more dangerous. Make sure you are subscribed and notifications are turned on, because in a situation evolving this fast, developments are happening hour by hour, and you do not want to fall behind. Let's begin with what actually happened this morning, and what it means in practical terms. U.S. Central Command, CENTCOM, officially announced that as of 10 a.m. Eastern Time on April 14th, American forces began enforcing restrictions on maritime traffic connected to Iran. The wording of the announcement was extremely precise. The blockade applies equally to vessels of all nationalities entering or leaving Iranian ports and coastal zones, including ports along the Arabian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. However, there is a key clarification. According to CENTCOM, freedom of navigation will not be restricted for ships passing through the Strait of Hormuz if they are traveling between non-Iranian ports. In simple terms, if your tanker is heading to Saudi Arabia, Iraq, or the UAE, you continue. If your destination is Iran, you turn back. Now, before this clarification, President Donald Trump had described the situation in much broader terms. Speaking on Fox News shortly before the announcement, he referred to it as a complete blockade. All or nothing, he said, suggesting that no ship would pass until Iran conceded. CENTCOM's statement significantly narrowed that interpretation. But make no mistake, the impact on Iran remains severe. And here is why. Iran's economy is not just dependent on maritime trade, it is fundamentally built around it. This is not exaggeration. The numbers speak for themselves. On average, Iran exports approximately $270 million worth of goods per day. Out of that, around $140 million comes from crude oil. The rest, roughly $80 million per day, consists of non-oil exports, petrochemicals, minerals, metals, and industrial goods. Almost all of it moves by sea. Now consider imports. Last year, Iran imported approximately $58 billion worth of goods. That comes out to about $160 million per day. These imports include everything from consumer goods to the raw materials required to keep Iranian industry running. Now, all of that is at risk. Let's break this down carefully. On the export side alone, Iran could lose around $8 billion per month. That is not a small disruption. That is a systemic economic shock. And the import side may be even more dangerous. If raw materials stop arriving, factories lose the inputs they need. When that happens, production stops. When production stops, jobs disappear. And when jobs disappear in a country already dealing with years of economic strain, the situation becomes unstable very quickly. This brings us to a critical point that many analysts are currently missing. The protests that shook Iran in recent years did not begin as political revolts. They began as economic protests. People were frustrated by rising prices, shortages, and what they saw as mismanagement. Those protests escalated to a level that seriously threatened the system. They were contained, but only through force. And the economic problems that triggered them never disappeared. They worsened. Now, with this blockade in place, those pressures are about to intensify dramatically, possibly to a catastrophic level. And there is something even more urgent. Time is not on Iran's side. Let's look at the oil storage situation. Iran has an estimated storage capacity of around 50 to 60 million barrels. Currently, approximately 60% of that capacity is already being used. That leaves only about 20 million barrels of available space. At the same time, Iran continues producing roughly 1.5 million barrels of crude oil per day. Do the math. At that rate, remaining storage capacity will be filled in roughly 2 weeks. After that point, Iran will have no choice. Oil wells will need to be shut down, and restarting them is not simple. Every shutdown leads to a permanent loss of production capacity, typically between 5 and 10%. That loss cannot be recovered. For an economy already under pressure, that is devastating. This is not just an economic problem. This is a ticking clock, and the Iranian leadership knows it. Now let's talk about Iran's response, because it has been both aggressive and deeply ironic. Iranian military officials quickly declared that the restrictions imposed by the United States are illegal. Members of Iran's parliamentary national security and foreign policy bodies dismissed the blockade as nothing more than a bluff. One of the spokespersons publicly stated that this move would be considered an act of war. He warned that Iran still has other options, cards that have not yet been played. He even addressed Washington directly, telling them to respect the Iranian people, accept defeat, and not attempt to demand at the negotiating table what could not be achieved through military means. Strong language. But now let's hold that position up against reality. This is the same system that, in recent months, has been involved in attacks on civilian shipping vessels from countries that had no direct involvement in the conflict. There was an incident involving a Thai-flagged vessel, Thailand, a country located on the other side of the world. In addition to that, Iran had effectively begun operating a system of maritime pressure in the Strait of Hormuz. Ships passing through were being forced to pay transit fees. Some estimates placed those fees as high as $2 million per vessel. This was happening in one of the most important global shipping corridors, an international waterway that, under established law, is not supposed to be controlled by a single country. Reports citing officials within Iran's own parliamentary structures confirmed that these payments were real, significant, and highly controversial from a legal standpoint. So when Iranian officials now describe the U.S. blockade as illegal or provocative, critics argue that there is a clear contradiction. Iranian forces escalated their rhetoric even further. They described the blockade as outright piracy. Warnings were issued that any military presence approaching the Strait of Hormuz could be interpreted as a violation of the ceasefire and would be met with force. At the same time, statements from semi-official Iranian sources indicated that the country's armed forces had been placed on maximum alert. And yet, despite all of this rhetoric, the ceasefire is technically still in place. Pakistan's Prime Minister confirmed that the ceasefire remains active and that diplomatic efforts are ongoing. So while tensions are rising, the situation has not completely collapsed. Not yet, but the pressure is building rapidly. Now let's move to what this blockade actually looks like in practice. Because enforcing a naval blockade in one of the busiest and most sensitive maritime routes in the world is extremely complex. Even before the official start time, ship tracking data showed that traffic through the Strait of Hormuz had already begun to decline significantly. Vessels were adjusting their routes. Some were slowing down. Others were avoiding the area altogether. One tanker registered in Comoros and previously linked to sanctioned Iranian oil transport activities was tracked moving through the strait shortly after the blockade came into effect. Another vessel, registered in Botswana, reportedly changed course within less than an hour after the U.S. deadline, redirecting its route away from Oman toward the UAE. A third vessel began broadcasting a drifting status near the coast of Keshm Island, essentially pausing operations while waiting to see how the situation would evolve. This is what uncertainty looks like in global shipping. According to early reports, the number of vessels passing through the Strait of Hormuz dropped sharply within a 24-hour period. Out of those that continued moving, only a small portion were carrying cargo such as oil, chemicals, or liquefied gas. The rest were either empty or had unclear cargo status. Legal experts are now closely monitoring the situation, because under international law, the legitimacy of a blockade depends heavily on how it is implemented. There are specific conditions. It must be officially declared. It must be enforced impartially. And humanitarian shipments, such as food and medical supplies, must be allowed through. Initial signals suggest that the United States is attempting to meet these requirements. Formal notices were issued prior to the enforcement of the blockade. However, the reality on the ground, or rather, at sea, is far more complicated. This is not a clean textbook blockade. It is a high-risk interdiction environment. Naval forces must identify vessels, track their movements, establish communication, redirect them if necessary, and potentially board them. All of this is happening in one of the most congested shipping lanes on Earth. The operational challenge is enormous. To support this effort, the United States has deployed significant military assets. Carrier strike groups, destroyers, and amphibious forces are currently positioned in the region. Additional naval power is present in nearby waters, including the Mediterranean. Reports also indicate that U.S. forces had already begun clearing naval mines previously placed in the area, an essential step before enforcing any serious maritime control operation. From a strategic standpoint, Iran's ability to directly challenge this blockade through conventional naval means appears limited. But that does not mean Iran lacks options. And this is where the situation becomes more dangerous. Iran has already begun signaling the possibility of expanding the conflict beyond the Strait of Hormuz, specifically toward another critical choke point, the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. For those unfamiliar, this passage sits at the southern entrance of the Red Sea, connecting it to the Gulf of Aden. It is one of the most important global trade routes. A significant portion of shipping that avoids the Persian Gulf passes through this corridor. And just north of it lies the Suez Canal, the key link between Asian and European markets. Any disruption at this point would have global consequences, and Iran knows that. This is not a theoretical threat. Iran maintains influence in the region through allied groups. In the past, these groups have demonstrated the ability to launch missile and drone attacks against commercial shipping in the Red Sea. Those operations lasted for months before being pushed back by coordinated military action, and they could resume. Analysts have already warned that Iran could activate these groups again to apply pressure. This would create a situation where the United States and its allies would need to manage two major maritime threats at the same time, enforcing a blockade in the Strait of Hormuz, while also protecting shipping routes in the Red Sea. That would significantly stretch resources, and that is part of the strategic calculation. Now we arrive at one of the most important dimensions of this entire situation, China, because this is not just about Iran, and it is not just about the United States. It is about global energy dependence. Almost all of Iran's oil exports are directed toward China. According to available trade data, this accounts for roughly 11 to 13% of China's total oil imports. And if you include unofficial transport networks, the so-called shadow fleet, that number could be even higher. But here is where the situation becomes far more complex. China does not just rely on Iran for energy. It relies on the entire Gulf region. Let's break that down clearly. Russia provides around 20% of China's oil imports. Iran contributes approximately 13%. And then you have Saudi Arabia, Iraq, the UAE, Oman, Kuwait, all major suppliers. What do they all have in common? Their oil moves through the same route, the Strait of Hormuz. When you combine all of that, you are looking at roughly 50% of China's total oil supply, depending on that single maritime corridor. Now think about what has happened. Who effectively disrupted the Strait of Hormuz? Not the United States. Iran did. Even with the blockade now in place, U.S. forces have made one thing very clear. They are targeting only vessels heading toward Iranian ports. Ships traveling to other Gulf countries are still allowed to pass, which means the disruption affecting the wider market is not coming from the blockade itself. It is coming from Iran's actions, closing access, laying mines, and imposing transit fees. And that puts China in an extremely uncomfortable position, because China needs stability, and right now, stability does not exist. Reports indicate that China had already begun applying quiet pressure on Iran before the blockade was even announced. There were diplomatic efforts underway, attempts to de-escalate the situation. China was actively involved in encouraging dialogue, including the talks that took place in Islamabad. Because Beijing has a clear priority: keep the strait open. China needs Iranian oil, but more importantly, it needs Gulf oil, and at this moment, both are under threat. According to sources familiar with U.S. strategy, there is an expectation in Washington that China will increase that pressure, because every single day that the strait remains unstable is a day that China's energy security weakens. China is the largest oil consumer in the world. It cannot sustain prolonged disruption. Now let's move to what happened in Islamabad, because this is where the diplomatic dimension becomes critical. There were negotiations. Long, intense negotiations. Vice President J.D. Vance traveled to Pakistan to lead the U.S. delegation. On the Iranian side, the talks were led by a senior political figure connected to Iran's parliamentary leadership. The delegation itself was large, reportedly around 100 officials. The discussions lasted for approximately 21 hours, and yet, no agreement was reached. So what exactly was being discussed? According to U.S. officials, several key conditions were presented. Let's go through them carefully. First, Iran would need to end all uranium enrichment activities. Second, major nuclear enrichment facilities would need to be dismantled. Third, any highly enriched material would need to be removed. Fourth, the Strait of Hormuz would need to be fully reopened, without restrictions or fees. Fifth, a broader regional framework for stability would need to be established, involving multiple actors. And sixth, Iran would need to stop supporting proxy groups operating in the region. One notable detail here: there were no explicit conditions mentioned regarding Iran's ballistic missile program. That appears to have been deliberately left out, possibly to make a deal more achievable. In addition to this, there were discussions about a long-term freeze on nuclear activity, potentially lasting around 20 years. After that period, a new framework could be renegotiated. Now here is where things get particularly interesting. Despite their public statements, Iranian representatives were reportedly willing to discuss aspects of the nuclear issue, but the gap between both sides remained extremely wide. And there was another problem, a structural problem. The individuals present in the room did not appear to have full authority to make final decisions. That matters, because negotiations can only succeed if the people at the table can actually say yes. During the talks, U.S. officials were able to communicate directly with leadership in Washington multiple times, but the Iranian delegation faced serious limitations. There were concerns about secure communication. There were fears that any attempt to contact decision-makers could be intercepted or tracked. As a result, Iran effectively sent a large delegation without the ability to finalize an agreement. This reveals two critical realities. First, the system itself is fragmented. Decision-making authority is not centralized in a way that allows rapid negotiation. Second, it shows a level of internal caution, or even distrust, that complicates diplomacy. But here is the key takeaway. The process is not over. The proposals presented during those talks have been taken back for further consideration. Decisions are now being made elsewhere. Those in positions of authority, whether political, military, or otherwise, are now evaluating their options. They can accept the terms, they can reject them, or they can respond with a counterproposal. And if that counterproposal falls within a range that Washington considers acceptable, then an agreement is still possible. Public statements from U.S. officials reflect this. There is a consistent message. The next move belongs to Iran. Even after announcing the blockade, there are indications that diplomacy remains open, which creates a very delicate balance. Pressure on one side, opportunity on the other. Now let's take a step back and look at the broader international dimension, because the effects of this situation are already spreading far beyond the region. The global response is beginning to take shape. European leaders are paying very close attention. There are already discussions about coordinated international efforts aimed at restoring stability and ensuring freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz. Plans are being considered for a multinational presence focused specifically on keeping maritime routes open. At the same time, governments across Europe are dealing with a very immediate problem: energy prices. The impact is already measurable. The conflict has triggered a sharp increase in energy costs across the European Union. Estimates suggest that the additional financial burden is already in the tens of billions of euros, and the situation is still developing. Emergency measures are being prepared to address rising costs and stabilize supply chains. Because this is not just a regional issue, it is a global economic pressure point. Now let's look at the oil market. Before the conflict began, Brent crude was trading at around $70 per barrel. Since then, prices have surged significantly, approaching or even exceeding $100 per barrel. That represents roughly a 40% increase. And the driving force behind that surge is clear: disruption in the Strait of Hormuz. This is one of the most critical energy corridors in the world. Roughly 20% of global oil and gas supply moves through that narrow passage. But it is not just oil and gas. The strait is also a key route for materials such as fertilizers, aluminum, and even helium. That means the effects ripple across multiple sectors: agriculture, manufacturing, technology. The consequences are interconnected. Governments are aware of this. Officials have already issued warnings that the situation is escalating and that the implications extend far beyond the immediate actors involved. International organizations have also weighed in. There is a clear message being repeated. There is no military solution to this situation. Calls for restraint have been issued. Calls for dialogue have been reinforced. Even countries that are typically aligned with one side or another are expressing concern about the broader impact on global markets, because uncertainty at this scale affects everyone. Now let's bring everything together. The United States has deployed one of the most powerful naval presences in the region in recent years. The blockade is active. Iranian oil exports are effectively frozen. Storage capacity is limited and filling quickly. Within approximately 2 weeks, Iran may be forced to begin shutting down oil production. Those shutdowns would cause permanent damage to an already strained economy. At the same time, internal economic pressure is building. There is a history of unrest linked directly to economic hardship. That history has not disappeared, and the conditions that created it are intensifying. But despite all of this, diplomacy is still alive. Fragile, but alive. The ceasefire has not been officially broken. There is no scheduled negotiation at this moment, but communication channels remain open. Mediation efforts continue. External actors are applying pressure, and there are indications that discussions around key issues are still possible. Now we arrive at the critical moment, the next 72 hours. This is the window that may determine the direction of everything that follows. Iran has two paths. One path leads toward escalation, activating regional allies, targeting additional shipping routes, attempting to challenge the blockade directly. That path carries enormous risk, not just for Iran, but for the entire region. The other path is negotiation, recognizing that the current trajectory leads to increasing pressure with decreasing leverage, understanding that economic timelines are moving faster than political ones, and making a decision while there is still something left to negotiate. The question is simple, but the answer is not. Do those making decisions fully understand the situation as it stands? Do they see how quickly the balance is shifting? Because this is not a situation that will resolve itself over time. Time is the very thing accelerating the pressure. And in moments like this, outcomes are not determined by waiting. They are determined by decisions. Decisions made under pressure. Decisions made with incomplete information. Decisions that carry consequences far beyond the immediate moment. That is why staying informed matters. That is why understanding the deeper forces, economic, military, and diplomatic, is essential. Because what is happening here is not just another headline. It is a turning point, and it is unfolding in real time. We will continue to follow every development closely, because based on everything we have laid out, this situation is not slowing down. It is accelerating.